colleagues, esteemed members of the National Academies. My name is Sebastian Porsdam Mann, and I'm recording this from Copenhagen. The reflections we've heard in this session show how bold ideas might be constrained in science. And this raises an important question. What happens when a truly transformative technology enters that same landscape? Let me discuss the example of generative AI, which offers extraordinary new possibilities. If we want to achieve breakthroughs in science, we must consider the potential of such emerging technologies that may expand our collective capacity for discovery. So the topic of this session is novel discoveries in meaning making, risky and challenging, but with transformative potential. And as just mentioned, the novel discovery I will be talking about is generative AI. And the meaning making is whether we can use this technology to further normative goals through the acceleration and improvement of science. And when I say science here, I mean science in its broad sense. So all disciplines that are characterized by systematic inquiry and a search for the truth. So this includes humanities and social sciences in addition to the natural sciences and STEM fields. And in my talk, I'll be making the case for the benefits side, not because risks don't exist or aren't important, but because the risks and challenges are already amply covered in the existing literature amongst my AI ethics colleagues, as well as in regulation. The EU AI Act, for example, discusses only risks and challenges and does not discuss proportionality or benefits at all. Now, from my vantage point as an ethicist, this is an issue because this isn't cautious ethics. It's only half of ethics. To do a proper ethical analysis, we need to look at both the benefits and the risks. It might well be that we still end up prioritizing or concluding that the risks are more important, but it wouldn't be intellectually honest to do this in the absence of a look at the benefits. Now, when we look at proportionality, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We already have ethical, regulatory, and legal frameworks that we can apply. And I'll be talking about one of these, namely the human right to science under international human rights law. So this is a human right that has its home in the same Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the same covenant and economic, social, and cultural rights that many other much more familiar human rights have. It is, I believe, a good framework for looking at these questions because it is binding international law and therefore is a common normative framework for most of the world's countries. And because, importantly, it has built-in proportionality tools. So the international human rights law framework, by its very nature, involves trade-offs for fulfilling rights against the resources required, trade-offs in balancing off the fulfillment of one right versus another, or the rights of some groups versus other groups or individuals. Now, the human right to science is in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this is an article that has several components. When people discuss the right to science, they generally mean Article 15(1)(b), which states that everyone has the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. However, generative AI is also relevant to Article 15(2), which places duties on states to conserve, develop, and diffuse science and culture, as well as for Article 15(3), which places obligations on states to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity. Finally, through its ability to translate both languages and also between methods and approaches, generative AI also is relevant to Article 15(4), which concerns duties related to international cooperation in science and culture. Now, why is it that generative AI is relevant here? Well, if used appropriately, it has the potential to bring certain resources, skills, methods, and tools into the hands of people that otherwise wouldn't have it. So generative AI can be prompted to generate computer code and write programs. As mentioned, it can translate between languages. It can act as a junior assistant in terms of finding relative information or transforming that information into other forms. And it can help with editing and dissemination of research. All of these things are resources, in a sense, that senior researchers in wealthy countries can afford to hire human labor for, but many junior people in wealthy countries, as well as people everywhere in the rest of the world, have trouble utilizing to their highest potential. Similarly, generative AI scales very well. So whatever tasks it can do well at scale. And this is not only a benefit in the normal sort of efficiency sense, but we have to remember that when it comes to research, a lot of it is publicly funded, and whether or not it's publicly funded, it addresses several real-life issues. So the longer it takes to do this, the more brakes we put on this process, the later or the less benefits will accrue to people in need out there. This might also be a bit counterintuitive, but generative AI can also be used to help preserve scholarly traditions, diverse voices, and institutional knowledge. And it can do this because if you give it sufficient information or data about a specific tradition, it will be able to simulate that and produce interactions that are on the basis of these materials. And as already mentioned, the translation capabilities and the ability to address paperwork and administrative tasks means that generative AI, if used correctly, can help further collaboration, both domestically and internationally and globally. So to make this all a bit more concrete, maybe many of you are thinking when it comes to generative AI, well, it can just write my manuscript for me. And there are many sort of ethical issues involved with that. And this is not really primarily what I mean. I look at generative AI in more of a systems perspective for science. So in scholarship, we know that there are many sort of guidelines or frameworks or checks and balances that are meant to protect research participants and guarantee the integrity of the scientific record, such as peer review or IRB or ethics review, or the need to detail your research in grant applications and in consent forms and so on. And all of these serve a very noble and important purpose, but the way they're implemented often leaves things to be desired. So we know that there's a crisis in peer review. There aren't sufficient reviewers with sufficient expertise given the increase in paper submissions. We know that IRB and ethics review committees are heavily understaffed and under-resourced. We know that grant applications take way too much time given the amount of funding that they give. And consent forms, likewise, are mainly or often reduced to institutional liability shielding rather than actually a process that is meant to explain the details of research to participants and make them understand the risks and benefits involved. So these sort of peripheral areas are areas that where I think that the generative AI can be used to speed up the research process without necessarily sacrificing on quality in ways that further these normative goals related to science as reflected in Article 15. And similar things can be said for science communication. Something that AI does incredibly well is translate your research into not only other languages, but also different reading levels, different communication styles. As I mentioned before, it can also help you program. So previously you would need to have years of experience with Python or some other programming language in order to do scientifically useful computation. But these days it is possible to instruct language models in your native language, and then the language model will create the computer program for you. And similar things can be said for literature synthesis. So all of this matters because we need a clear-eyed view of both the benefits and the risks for something that is so fundamental and something that is poised to make such a huge impact. Whether you like it or not, this technology is here. it is being used. We know this from several studies. And we have to deal with it in a way that's intellectually honest. And this shouldn't really be controversial. Proportionality is a historically well-known ethical principle that is considered foundational to ethical analysis. And it is legally required not only under international human rights law, as I just mentioned, but also in EU law and in many domestic legal traditions. So I'm going to finish where I started, saying that even if we ultimately focus or end up judging that the risks are more important than the benefits, we must first take the benefits seriously. Because if we get this wrong, we could be missing a huge opportunity to advance human knowledge and well-being in ways that further normative goals. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the question and answer.